guys, it's Dasha. Welcome back to my channel, and welcome to today's video where I'm going to be giving you some book recommendations. Today's recommendations are going to be based on some young adult novels going into some adult novels. And I know a lot of people usually do this in terms of like, if you like this, try this, but I'm going to do if you didn't like this, try this instead. So if you didn't like a particular young adult novel, try this adult novel instead. I have 6 young adult books that I would like to talk about, leading into about 8 recommendations, because there's a couple of them that I have 2 recommendations for. And of course, all of these recommendations can work the other way as well. If you liked one, you might like the other. If you didn't like one, you might want to try the other, and it goes across both age categories. So the first one is Wilder Girls by Rory Power. If you did not like this, I would really recommend you try the Southern Reach trilogy by Jeff Vandermeer, the first book of which is Annihilation. So both of these are very weird sci-fi, almost fantasy hybrids involving weird diseases, weird plants, weird animals that are just a little bit off. Wilder Girls specifically follows an all-girls boarding school set on an island, and at some point a weird disease breaks out that gives the girls these weird mutations. A lot of them die and the rest of them are forced to try and survive. Their government abandons them completely, just sending a little bit of food every now and then, but until they can figure out what exactly this disease is, these girls are on their own. And when I say mutations, I mean everything from scales to missing eyeballs to like gills and all sorts of like really weird stuff. The Southern Reach trilogy, on the other hand, at least Annihilation, the first book, follows an expedition out to Area X. It is a really mysterious zone where there's all sorts of really weird fauna and flora that no one has ever seen before. The problem is every expedition party that goes out to try to research it either disappears, kills each other, kills themselves, comes back with weird diseases, or comes back saying everything's fine and beautiful. It's a really weird space. No one knows what happens once you do get in there, and you are following the 12th expedition to go and try to research this area. The reason I say that you might like this if you didn't like Wilder Girls is Wilder Girls focused a lot on characters, and there was like a relationship, and while that might be appealing to some readers, I know for me it kind of detracted from the really eerie, weird sci-fi elements of this, and I found that Annihilation gave me everything I wanted in terms of that weird sci-fi slash fantasy aspect. The atmosphere was incredible. The weird sci-fi elements and like these things that you've never heard of but you can imagine quite vividly worked really, really well in this book, and I was just missing it a little bit from Wilder Girls. So this book gave me all of that, and I think if you too were kind of disappointed by the ending of Wilder Girls, or you thought that the relationship was kind of unnecessary or it detracted from the atmosphere and the kind of really weird elements that you were really into, I think this book will give you everything you were looking for. The next recommendation is for A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. If you did not like that, I would really recommend The 100,000 Kingdoms by N.K. Jemisin, the first book in the Inheritance trilogy. Granted, A Court of Thorns and Roses is kind of a new adult series. It's kind of in that really weird in-between space in terms of publishing, where it's classified as both, but like the later books in the series are definitely adult, whereas the earlier books are young adult. So I'm gonna call it young adult specifically for A Court of Thorns and Roses, which is the only one in the series that I have read. A Court of Thorns and Roses follows Feyre, who is a human girl in a world that is inhabited by fairies. She is hunting one day to provide for her family when she accidentally kills a Fey prince. And in return, she has to go and live out the rest of her days in the Fey lands as a return, as like a blood debt for the prince that she killed. Meanwhile, 100,000 Kingdoms is a bit more complex. You're following a woman who is sent to the capital city of this empire in a bid for the throne. Her family currently sits on the throne, but she was a little bit exiled because her mother was a bit of an outcast, yet she is one of the few remaining relatives who is powerful enough to lead this empire. The other thing is, when she actually arrives, there is a lot more going on. There's only 2 other people that are in line for the throne that she competes against, but there's a lot of politics at play. And the reason this family is so powerful is that they have enslaved some gods. And so she has to figure out how to communicate with these gods, how to use them to her advantage, how to play these political games, all while also dealing with the grief over losing her mother and trying to figure out what actually happened. On first glance, these books sound really, really different, and granted, they are. To me, the reason I thought that these were similar was the main relationship. So in ACOTAR, you have a human and fairy relationship, versus in here you have a human and god relationship. And I think if you were left kind of unsatisfied by that aspect in ACOTAR like I was, I think you might enjoy this a lot more. It was very spicy. It was a little bit different from typical like human romances that you read. It definitely added an interesting layer to it in terms of how these people viewed relationships and love and communication, and it definitely brought a different layer to it that you don't find in a lot of romances. And in terms of ACOTAR, I just thought that the buildup was really unsatisfying, and I thought that it kind of happened too fast and there was no chemistry. But in here, you can absolutely feel it, and it was a lot more interesting for that reason. Obviously, these worlds are massively different. These plots are completely different. Yes, they both have some politics and they have some kind of supernatural aspects to it, but at the end of the day, these plots are massively different. And ultimately, I would say if it was the romance that let you down in ACOTAR, I would absolutely give this a try for all of that human and not human romance needs that you might be looking for. Also, N.K. Jemisin is just a far better person than Sarah J. Maas will ever be. The next two are both very popular books, so this might not be like the hottest take, but if you did not like Shadow and Bone by Leigh Bardugo, you might enjoy The Poppy War by R.F. Khan. So Shadow and Bone is young adult fantasy following Alina, who is a young woman who comes into these powers that she didn't know she had, and they might just be the powers that her nation is looking for to help them get rid of this grand space that is just eating and ruining everything. She might be the only one that can actually banish the darkness from this space and save her country. Meanwhile, The Poppy War is also about a young female protagonist who aces this test to get into the best military academy her country has to offer. Once she gets there, however, she realizes that she is possibly harboring some secret powers that can either be used for good or for evil, and it is up to her to decide how she takes that path. Also, while she is at school, not even finishing up her studies, a war breaks out and she is sent off to figure out these powers on her own without the help of her crazy professor. The reason I think that you might enjoy The Poppy War if you didn't enjoy Shadow and Bone is that Shadow and Bone derailed itself a lot from the plot and the magic by focusing on Alina's relationships, and I found that it really hindered the books. I thought that Alina was a very interesting, complex character on her own. She was an orphan who was dealing with feelings of insecurity relating to her power, but she was also very stubborn, and she always stood her ground. And she was not always the most likable character, but in that sense, she became a lot more realistic. And I think that is the strong point of The Poppy War as well. Our main character in The Poppy War is also a bit of an unlikable protagonist. She is also very stubborn. She is not necessarily the nicest person. She is just fighting to stay alive and be recognized by this academy where her peers think very little of her. And her powers can also be used like Alina's for good or for evil. And it's very interesting to see how these characters develop. So I think if you really do enjoy female protagonists that are not constantly derailed by love interests, I think The Poppy War might deliver that for you. That's not to say there's no romance in The Poppy War, but it is definitely less of a focus than the incredibly fascinating magic and world and politics and warfare of The Poppy War. Meanwhile, in Shadow and Bone, yes, you get a lot of the kind of magical elements, and it's focused on a lot more than in some of other of Leigh Bardugo's books, but at the end of the day, the story is about Alina and her relationships and her feelings, and I find it really detracts from the really interesting plot, and I feel like Alina would have developed a lot better in terms of her magic and this kind of battle between good and evil if she had not had her relationships. So if that's something that bothered you, give The Poppy War a try. The next book I want to talk about is Six of Crows, also by Leigh Bardugo, and for this one I actually have two recommendations depending on what you did not like with this book. Alternatively, what you did like. It all depends how you view this. Six of Crows is another young adult fantasy set in the same world as Shadow and Bone, except in this you are following a different cast of characters who are all living in the underground of the city of of Ketterdam. These people are all thieves and they're all liars and cheats and gamblers, and they are recruited to perform an impossible heist, theoretically. But of course, our characters are always up for the task, especially because there is a lot of money at stake. If this was sold to you as just a heist story and you were really frustrated that it got bogged down by the characters' backstories and by relationships, I might recommend that you try Foundryside by Robert Jackson Bennett. This is set in a kind of Medici era Venice inspired city. It has a really cool magic system where you can kind of code objects into behaving a certain way, and you're following Sanchia, who is a thief, kind of street urchin, and she is hired to steal something. The problem is when she steals this object, she realizes that it holds a lot more power than she thought, and there are people after her, and there is another heist down the road that she's gonna get involved in. The thing about this book that makes it a little bit different from Six of Crows is that you really are plotting a heist the whole time, and while there is still a lot of focus on things like politics and you're kind of seeing side characters, it's not as character focused specifically as Six of Crows. You do get a little bit of Sanchia's backstory, but it's really just to kind of build up her character. All the side characters don't have these elaborate backstories. You still really get that good found family element, and you get a lot about the world and the politics and the secrets that start getting unlocked, but this really does focus a lot more on the plot and the heist and planning all of this, while Six of Crows seems to focus more on characters than the plot, and even though they are planning the heist the whole time, the heist seems almost secondary to building up these characters. However, if you did enjoy the characters in here, it was more of the heist that you found either underwhelming or kind of unrealistic, then I would recommend you try The Lies of Loch Lamora by Scott Lynch. I recommend this one a lot for fans of Six of Crows because truly it just takes some of those core ideas and builds off of them so magnificently. Funnily enough, this also follows a kind of Renaissance era Venetian inspired city. You follow Loch Lamora, who is the leader of the Gentlemen Bastards, which are a group of thieves. These thieves steal from the rich and hoard it all for themselves, because what else is the point of stealing if you're just gonna give it all away? There is a massive plot here that involves not necessarily a heist, but more of a long con on certain upperclassmen of society, and it definitely is a bit more, I don't want to call it more realistic than Six of Crows, but just a little bit. It doesn't involve these grand events that, you know, these like last moment saving graces. It's definitely a bit more of a slow burn, but it is really rewarding. And the other thing that you get out of this is also that character work. You get a lot of Locke's backstory. You get a whole section at the beginning of how he was brought to the founder of the Gentlemen Bastards and how he took over for him. And you also get to see his relationship with the other Gentleman Bastard, especially Jean, who is his friend, and their bromance is just fantastic. And it's just a lot of fun to see these characters get to shine in terms of their personality and their story, but also focus on this really expansive plot to take down some of the noblemen in a very clever way. Everything about this book is really clever, and if you were kind of disappointed by the plot and the heist in Six of Crows and you thought it was maybe a little bit too convenient, I think this might definitely be up your alley a little bit more. Did I say 6? I might have 7. Apparently I don't know how to count. The next book we're going to talk about is The Wicked Deep by Shay Earnshaw. This one is a little bit of a stretch, but stay with me. I think if you were not too into this, you might like Hex by Thomas Old Houvelt. The Wicked Deep is this kind of paranormal, supernatural contemporary that follows a small town that is cursed. About 150 years ago, I believe, 3 sisters were accused of witchcraft and drowned in the harbor. Every single summer they come back, they possess the body of one of the teenage girls in the town, and the teenage girls go on a killing spree of teenage boys as revenge for the witches' deaths. I really like the curse aspect of this book. I thought it was really cool. The atmosphere was fantastic. But as usual, a lot of this story was derailed by an unnecessary romance that kind of fell into the trap of being a little cheesy and trying to add unnecessary drama to things. So I think that if you enjoyed the idea of this curse that's put on this town and the town has to learn how to live with it rather than try to get rid of it, I think you would really like Hex for this exact reason. Hex also follows a small town that is cursed. This time it is the curse of the Black Rock Witch, who died 300 years ago, as a result of being a witch. She walks the town to this day. Her eyes and her mouth are sewn shut, but she still decides to walk around the town, show up in people's homes, and everyone just accepts it. They have set up a notification system. It is set in modern day, so they have set up a notification system to notify other towns members when she shows up in someone's house or when she shows up at the store, so that in case there are any outsiders, they can try to cover her up or hide her. The other aspect of the curse is not just that the witch is still sort of alive, it's that if you are born into the town or if you move into the town, you may never leave. And so again, these townspeople have to learn how to live with this, how to cope with this, and the plot kind of starts when a group of teenagers decide that they want to try and kick off the curse. So as I mentioned, The Wicked Deep has this kind of romance and teenage drama that really kind of derails from the interesting curse and witchy vibes and the atmosphere of this that I think Hex does a really, really good job of maintaining throughout. You really feel creeped out, but you're also really intrigued by the way that the town has learned to deal with the curse and the kind of loopholes that they have found and the ways they found to cope with it. And I thought that was really the interesting part of both of these books. I thought they both did a fantastic job of showing how people can really learn to live with this kind of thing, and like you start thinking about what you would do in this context. Obviously, Hex was a lot more gruesome, a lot more disgusting, and a lot darker since it is an adult horror novel rather than a young adult kind of paranormal novel. So be warned, if you are picking up Hex on my recommendation, it is nothing like this in terms of the level of gore, but they're both quite dark and witchy. Hex just takes it a lot further. So the final young adult book I am going to give recommendations for is The Maze Runner, in fact the Maze Runner series by James Dashner. And for this one I also kind of have two recommendations. So this is a young adult dystopian about a world where solar flares have released all sorts of diseases into the world, and the first book follows a group of teenagers that are dropped in the middle of this massive maze and have to figure out how to survive and how to live with each other despite a lot of surprises that get thrown their way. And the purpose of this maze, we find out at a certain point, is that they're trying to find a cure for the main disease that has ravaged the earth following these solar flares. If you enjoyed the setting of The Maze Runner, but you thought it was kind of maybe unrealistic or you thought it was a little bit exaggerated, you might enjoy Wool by Hugh Howey. Wool is a post-apocalyptic novel following humans that are living in an underground silo. It is basically the silos that we see above ground for grain, but just buried. So there's one single staircase that takes them all the way down. People live on different levels, and you cannot go up into the actual earth because you will die. The atmosphere is extremely poisonous, so humans are forced to live underground. And you are following some people in this silo that are trying to discover the truth about what the basically government at the silo is trying to hide. The reason I recommend this to you if you didn't like The Maze Runner is that the silo is a lot more realistic than the maze in here is. While the setting of the maze is really cool, you really have to suspend your disbelief and stop thinking about how it functions because it seems crazy unrealistic. Whereas the silo in the Wool series is a lot more believable and it feels a lot more real based on how the people in the silo interact with it and with one another. While the kind of political and overall world plots are a lot different, I think that in terms of really cool post-apocalyptic settings, this and Wool just really have some of the best ones, and like I said, the one in Wool is just so much more believable than the maze is. However, if you didn't really care for the setting, that wasn't your biggest gripe. The biggest gripe was that they were supposed to be researching for some kind of vaccine or cure for these diseases, but it got derailed by these really weird plots and side events. You might enjoy The Girl with All the Gifts by M.R. Carey. This is classified as an adult horror, but I think it's kind of a bit more of a sci-fi. I don't want to give too much away about the plot of this one because I think the less you know going into it, the more fun it will be. But based on what I said about, trying to find a cure for something, I think you would be a lot more interested in the kind of scientific realism that it's grounded in as opposed to this one. And I think you might enjoy this slightly more focused and tight-knit plot of The Girl with All the Gifts. If you want a bit of a synopsis, I will just give you what is on the back of the book and on Goodreads, just that you are following a young girl who goes to school every morning, but she has to get strapped into a chair and she doesn't really realize why, but she really likes going to school because there's a really nice nice teacher there, and she doesn't know why everyone treats her like she's some kind of monster, and you slowly get to discover the world through her eyes. Like I said, obviously by saying that they're both kind of about a cure slash vaccine, it's giving a little bit away, but I really think if you thought that this was way too long-winded and plot twisty for no reason, you should really give The Girl with All the Gifts a try. And that's it for these recommendations. Let me know if you have read some of these or if you are interested in picking some of them up on my recommendation. Also, if you have any other read-alikes, or, you know, if you didn't like some of these young adult ones but you've read similar adult ones, please let me know in the comments below. My social media is linked down below. You guys can always come talk to me there. And other than that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!